Hello everybody, welcome back or welcome to my channel. I hope if you have any symptoms that they go away soon, and if you're in the UK like me, I hope you're enjoying the sun. Hell knows, it's sunny outside when I'm filming this. I bet by the time I upload it, it will be torrential rain again. But anyways, obviously Hollywood is no stranger to portraying people with disabilities and facial differences in a negative light. From Star Wars to A Nightmare on Elm Street, there are several different films across the past few decades that don't take too kindly to people with facial differences. And I do want to talk about a few of them broadly, but really, James Bond franchise is something that takes the cake. Because as a whole franchise, 7 of his past 10 films feature people with facial differences, and they're all villains. Let's talk about it. So the author of this franchise, Ian Fleming, had the idea to write a spy novel for a decade before he finally bit the bullet. Get it? And started writing one of the biggest spy franchises ever made. Now the idea came about after he read about the exploits of British secret agent in the archives of the British Intelligence Service during the war. In early 1952, he sat down and started typing on his typewriter, and thus James Bond was born. He set out with an idea, a plan, and a goal. Something I really need to do as a maybe ADHD babe. 2,000 words a day, 5 days a week, for up to 2 months. In the month of 1953, the first book was released, and it did well. 9 years later, the first film adaptation was made, and now here we are 60 odd years later, with 25 films in the franchise. Now out of these 25 films, 10 feature characters with facial differences. That's 40%. And you may say, oh, the first film was in the 60s. It was a product of the times. Which I say,
your mum.
Firstly. Secondly, the Daniel Craig era of films has had almost half of the characters with facial differences. So if anything, it's gotten worse. Now, before I get into James Bond, let me just talk to you about the general kind of attitude and climate towards people with facial differences. Now, disabilities in popular media are still something that are tied to a lot of stereotypes and pretty reductive and generic tropes. Whether it's a hero who triumphs over his disability to become a saviour, sometimes with other enhanced skills to fill the void that their disability is made, or a hapless victim or child who just needs to be saved. People with disabilities are rarely afforded the same amount of nuance in films as their able-bodied counterparts. Now, in what seems to be a rebellion of the more saintly aspects forced upon them, many disabled characters are forced to be villains. Captain Hook, Voldemort, transphobic bitch, witches. Disability is used as a sense of depravity to show a detachment from normalcy or purity. Now an even easier way of doing this is having the disability show up where we all first look. The face. Obviously James Bond is far from the first to do this, and across loads of films like The Lion King, Nightmare on Elm Street, the list will go on. There's plenty of media that adheres to the rule, facial scar, facial difference equals evil. Now, on the off chance someone does watch this and get all angry and be like, oh, but how do you want disabled people to be displayed? There's obviously nothing inherently wrong with just having a disabled villain or a disabled superhero, obviously. But the problem is that they're often written in a very ignorant way, and one that tends to reinforce stereotypes and social biases about disabled people that are already there. Many in the villains of James Bond that do have facial differences kind of have the same unanimous energy when it comes to talking about or considering their facial differences. Whether it's Jaws with his modified teeth for assassinations, Trevelyan's extensive scarring from surviving an explosion, or Blofeld's ever-changing eye scars and missing earlobes, facial differences are used in these films to indicate one of two things. Either just pure evil through intimidation, or more recently, a character to sympathise with. It's honestly so lazy and, to be frank, awful to use facial differences in this way in storytelling over and over, and it's honestly problematic as fuck. Now obviously it goes without saying that all forms of media can and will affect our perceptions of reality. Where that can be harmful is when people are taking on content about a group of people or types of people that they typically have no interaction with on a day-to-day. So then they are forming all of their thoughts about how to treat them, the type of people they are, from this. And this obviously doesn't just go for disabled people. Loads of people form their biases against black people from just taking in stuff in the media, and it's not just, films and media, it's also headlines, how different newspapers talk about things that affect black people to things that affect white people, and how, I don't know, even broadcasters will report on things or choose not to report on things There have been calls on James Bond to stop using this outdated trope, but every time they basically say they don't give a fuck and continue. Now, thankfully, BFI has said that it won't fund any films that use visual differences as a marker for villainy, and there's a lovely campaign by Changing Faces called I Am Not Your Villain, which aims to counter this. The reality is, though, that such a huge franchise as Bond is going to have an effect on people, no matter how small, on how society views people with facial differences, especially children, as a lot of their films are viewed by families in cinemas. Yeah, so now, when I initially wrote the script, it was just about James Bond because obviously it's statistics of just how many characters with facial differences it's had and how bad it was, is something definitely to write about and have a case study. But recently I watched The Witcher season 3, and my god, do they have a problem with portraying people with facial differences, and it's just a demonstrator of what I'm talking about. Now, The Witcher is of course a fantasy TV show based on a series of novels with the same name, which follows protagonists Geralt, Yennefer and Ciri in a world filled with magic, monsters and mayhem. Season 3 gave us 3 characters with facial differences: Rience, Lydia and Vilgefortz. Now, surprising nobody, they are all in fact villains! Let me just get a bit more into all 3 of them for you. Lydia is known as the woman without a voice, and the only one of the 3 to have a facial differences happen pre-show. Now, in the books, she studied a magical artifact and it went wrong and it caused an explosion which blew off the bottom half of her face and her larynx. And now she has it with a spell, but she still can't speak, therefore only using telepathy. In her final scene on the show, just before she dies, she reveals her true face, and it's very much used as an indicator of how evil this woman is. It's meant to scare you. Now, Rience is an evil fire mage, the only one we see in the show. He is sadistic, which is reference for his love of fire, because the show changes things from the books where it's fire is like even more evil. So basically anyone who uses it, they're like, oh my god, you're depraved. Now, his face is burned when Yennefer, our protagonist, spits alcohol through his flame onto his face, which was a boss move, I will say. And finally, Vilgefortz. He's also a mage, but was with the side of good people. But he basically reveals at the end of season 3 that he's evil and he's been conspiring against everyone. And then right after that, he's got an explosion which also, you guessed it, blows off some of his face. Now, there is a link for all 3 characters here. If you haven't put that together, I don't know what to say. But it's very much that their facial differences are all a consequence of being evil. Especially for Rience and Vilgefortz, who it happens to on the show. And it's honestly a trope that we see so much in media, and it's just really disappointing. I really hated to see it too, because I actually quite enjoyed The Witcher season 3, and not so much for its plot, but really because the hair and makeup for the black characters was exquisite. We had some really great locks, we had really nice full beats, we had bantu knots, we had braids. So it was really enraging to see on one side like such a success for diversity and equity, and then the other side such a regression and a step back. And yeah, I think closing up, I just want to say there is plenty of research that demonstrates, like I've said before, that media will and can affect our perception of people and can base people's reactions to things maybe unknown to them based on what they've consumed about them in media. Now, a study by a group called Gender Action Portal did prove this. So they conducted a randomized experiment in a rural area in Mexico. They used an episodic soap opera radio show about a couple where as time goes on, the man slowly, progressively becomes more violent. I'll link more information about this in the description, but kind of summary is that the soap opera was broadcast using a community loudspeaker that only reached a certain portion of the community. After the broadcast period was ended, members of the community were asked to complete a survey on gender-based violence. Listeners of the broadcast basically had generally better views on gender-based violence than the people that didn't. That is to say, they, number one, thought it was worse, but number two, seemed like they were more likely to spot the signs and said they'd be more likely to report or expose it in the community than the people who hadn't listened to the broadcast. Now, obviously, this is only one study, yes, but there are scores of studies that have very much demonstrated just how much media can affect us and our perceptions of people. From social media, kind of adjusting our perceptions of our own selves, to news affecting our views of the world outside our home, to common tropes on TV shows affecting how we view the demographics that are often portrayed in these tropes. And there's so many shows and movies that portray people with facial differences in less than favourable ways. And it's almost no wonder that ableism continues on, especially ableism at people with facial differences, because media is telling us that it's okay and actually that it should be the way. Time and time again, people treat people with facial differences and disabilities as a whole, but that's another video, terribly. And this franchise is adding on to it by splashing money on the laziest fucking writing ever. Now, I'll just properly close this video off by saying, I'm not saying you can't have disabled villains, superheroes, you know, including those with facial differences. Actually, you can and you should. But to limit them by writing the same lazy stereotypes and tropes over and over again, come on, do better. I'm sure you all have the brain power to do it. Now, all I can hope is that the upcoming filmmakers of tomorrow do better, but honestly, the way society has treated disabled people since the pandemic, I'm not so sure.